Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here with us. We are set for an exciting session in today's webinar, which has been generously supported by the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Our focus today will be on a critical issue, the effectiveness of major platforms in adhering to the latest EU regulations aimed at curbing climate disinformation. We will explore the extent of their efforts. Are they truly making the mark? But with your permission, let me first number a few housekeeping rules. As you might have noticed, this session is being recorded and the replay will be available on DisinfoLab YouTube channel and also in our Climate Clarity Hub, a space that we have recently launched, which is dedicated to empowering the community countering climate disinformation. We are going to use the tool Slido during the Q&A. You can already start connecting to Slido by scanning the QR code that you see on the screen or at slido.com #disinfo. So just to get started and to get acquainted with Slido, would you please let us know where are you joining us from today? All right, France, DigiClima, Brussels, Berlin. Thank you very much. What a great community we have today with us. I have another question. Which sector do you represent? In the meantime, please let me introduce myself. I am Ana Romero-Vicente, I'm a researcher at DisinfoLab. I'm delighted to welcome you today to one of the DisinfoLab webinars. We are hosting online meetings every week that are designed for the counter-disinformation community to meet, to listen firsthand to investigations, to case studies. These are webinars for any kind of responses to disinformation, so your ideas on what topics to cover in these webinars are more than welcome. Thank you very much. Welcome again to everyone. Without further delay, I am pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Devin Bahceci, a strategic communication professional with experience in countering disinformation. Hi, Devin. Thanks for joining us. You are the Information Integrity and Anti-Disinformation Manager at the Global Strategic Communication Council and also expert member of the Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition, from where you support initiatives to minimize the spread of disinformation that could hinder climate action. It's a privilege to have you here as you're going to share exclusive insights from Climate Action Against Disinformation Coalition's recent investigation. These findings are particularly timely and important as they provide a fresh perspective on the ways large online platforms are managing the response to climate disinformation. While the full report is yet to be made public, the preliminary data suggests that these platforms may not be as effective as necessary in addressing the spread of false information about climate change. We're looking forward to hearing about these findings, Devin, and engaging afterwards in a dynamic question and answer sessions. For that, please make sure you stay connected to Slido with the QR code displayed on the screen so you can type your questions. Devin, you are the host, so you should be able to share your screen and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will just share my screen to talk about a little bit about what is going on in the legislation level and what the responses of the large platforms in general to disinformation and in specific climate disinformation threat. Let me start with a joke. I was just a couple of people from Climate Action Against Disinformation was just sowing the tweets and slacking about the event, and a couple of them said that, hey, Devin, actually, you can just go there and say that, hey, they don't respond, they don't do anything, and you can just finish the webinar. Unfortunately, the situation is a little bit like that. You will see in the details that although EU has one of the most sophisticated and improved legislations against disinformation, we don't see enough response from the platforms. Having said that, EU legislation is good, but it can be much better. Even this minimum standards that EU put globally doesn't being followed by the platforms. Let me share my screen and we can start slow by slow. Anytime if you have any questions, any comments, happy to answer them. And I will try to finish the slides in 20 minutes so that we can talk more about approaches and more about what can be done together to prevent the climate disinformation infodemic in online ecosystems. Yes. Slideshow. Can you see the screen? Is it all fine?
Yes, it's fine, Devin.
Yeah. The presentation will have two different sections. One is about why we are doing this, why the climate disinformation we think is an important trend in the EU, and what kind of impacts we see regarding disinformation and so on. But before we start, I would like to mention that we do climate people have a lot of analogies about the pollution made by fossil companies in our environment and the pollution made by them in information ecosystem. Like CO2, like carbon emissions, disinformation is a byproduct of the activities mainly made by vested interests as they want to protect their status quo, as they want to stall climate action. For us, disinformation is a tool in media ecosystem that damages natural ecosystems and climate because it hinders the progress against climate change as it manipulates public perception and creates a non-truthful perspective about reality. Climate disinformation battle in EU. Couple of data about information about why disinformation is a threat in EU. In the EU, in June, we will see more than 400 million people will vote in EU elections. And we have seen in the past, there are many reports showing that foreign states, domestic political groups, conspiracy theorists, hate groups spread disinformation to manipulate EU affairs and public opinion. This has been done in previous elections. Recently, for instance, there was an article in Politica about Russian interference and how MPs are using the propaganda of Russia against Ukraine, for instance. But we have seen a lot of different dimensions of disinformation and how it undermines democratic processes, erode trust, erode social unity, compromise public health initiatives, and weaken foreign policy positions in the EU. We also know that disinformation actors leverage social media, exploit social fault lines, and use state-backed media outlets to rapidly disseminate false information campaigns. All of you probably know that one of the biggest responses of the EU was the Digital Services Act. It started to be implemented very soon at the beginning of this year. And because of that, as Climate Action Against Disinformation members, we decided to check what officially has been provided by tech platforms in the scope of EU regulations, including DSA, and how those reports are indicating how they battle against climate disinformation and in general disinformation. As Anna mentioned, the report will come on Thursday because in March, platforms published a new report about their activities. That's why we had to slightly change the analysis in the last minute to cover the latest submission of the platforms. Initially, this study was made in February. It was supposed to publish it at the end of March, but due to the recent submission of the reports by the platforms, we have changed and updated the analysis. Climate disinformation, specifically threat in the EU. Climate misinformation and disinformation are on the rise in the EU. You have seen the recent report from CCDH about how new narratives, new climate denial narratives are emerging, how climate disinformation is getting sophisticated. 30 years ago, climate denial was only the narrative angle, which is outright denial of climate completely, but since then it evolved a lot. And recently we see more and more attacks to actors, attacks to solutions like renewable energy, and we see more and more narratives we called climate delay. These narratives not extensively attack the notion of climate change, but they attack the solutions, they attack the policies. For instance, in Europe, we have seen a lot of protests recently by farmers, and we have seen a lot of narratives among those discussions which are wrong, which are factually wrong regarding the climate change actions in the agricultural policy. And also, lastly, one of the other revenue of the narratives is greenwashing. And since climate became a huge public concern, we have seen that products, public level products, companies have been using tools to exaggerate what they do for climate change or what they do for sustainability or sustainable development, rather than ramping up their actions to draw a falsely green image of their companies. What climate disinformation does. We see three main fields of climate disinformation in the impact of climate policy and overall public conversations. One is we see a lot of cases where climate disinformation undermines decision-making and stalls climate action, like farmers' protests or like recent attacks to green claims directive in Europe are one of the good examples of that kind of approaches. So disinformation is generally, we see, is targeted and targeting certain moment, certain policy to derail action. Another thing we more and more start to see, that's why it is very important for the EU election, is that climate disinformation has become a tool, a weapon by far right and by foreign interference, foreign actors to undermine liberal and democratic values. We see more and more how climate narratives have been used to convince vulnerable societies about big global climate conspiracy and to drive them away from democratic or liberal values, to create a sense of unseen control over them. And that has been used a lot during the elections. We have seen that many times climate disinformation has been used by far-right groups to attack the status quo of liberal and democratic values. And last one is, of course, beyond attacking the content, attacking climate change related scientific information, we also see more and more climate scientists and advocates are facing increased online attacks and targeted harassment campaigns. In Europe, we see a lot of attacks against Greta. In US recently, Michael Mann, one of the famous climate scientists, won a defamation case against a couple of fossil fuel companies who were lying about him. I want to also show this picture to you. It's not from Europe, but it is a certain example of how climate change disinformation is weaponized during the election times. For instance, you see this graphic is from the last US elections, and this graphic shows the advertisement spending of 5 top fossil fuel companies in the US. As you can see, between the climate plan, Biden's climate plan, and the US elections, the advertisements of fossil fuel companies increased 10 times. This shows that although Facebook or the tech platforms don't label them as political ads, this shows that these advertisements are targeting the political decision-making and elections, key decisions like climate plan or US elections, which was very important for the climate angle. So that is the biggest worry for us. That is the thing, the main difference between disinformation and misinformation. Misinformation, we do have a lot of things that we know true, might be wrong, and but we don't have an intent. We don't have the knowledge about them, whether they are wrong or true. When it comes to disinformation, when it comes to dissemination of disinformation, it's an intentful act. That's why it has a purpose. That's why the actors who try to disseminate that wrong information has interest in it. And when it comes to climate change, it is climate action. And in many ways, it is also democratic and liberal processes, because we know that more than 70% of Europeans ask for more robust climate action, and we don't see the same reflection in the policy level. And one of the reasons why we don't see the same reflection is climate disinformation. The EU's response to disinformation, I'm sure most of you know very well. I just wanted to go through what EU does and also edit also legislations that are not directly maybe related to disinformation, but might be used to combat against disinformation. First, EU recognized the urgent need of tackle mis and disinformation in their foreign interference to democratic processes report. They call all the EU countries to address the threat of climate disinformation, because we also see a lot of foreign interference when it comes to climate disinformation in the EU. Beyond that, EU introduced in 2018 the Code of Practice. It's a voluntary regime for the platforms to provide voluntary reports about how they combat many different issues, including disinformation. And later, at the beginning of this year, we have DSA. We have this DSA to be introduced European-wise to make internet a safer place. And DSA has really extensive content that outlines all the responsibilities of large online platforms such as Facebook, such as Twitter, or search engines such as Google. And also, it converted the voluntary code of practice into mandatory participation. Now, code of practice is a mandatory for tech platforms to operate in the EU. These are two main pieces of specifically targeting the platforms to combat climate disinformation, but there are two other things that can be considered considered for dealing with climate disinformation too. The Green Claims Act, which is a recent act that identifies the parameters about how companies can claim their activity is green or sustainable, and it mainly aims to curb greenwashing activities. And the other one, the last one, is very new big directive, which is called Corporate Social Responsibility Directive, that mandates more than 50,000 companies in the EU operates to provide reports about what they do in the scope of corporate social responsibility. And we believe that especially for media companies, publishers, advertising organizations or companies, and for platforms, corporate social responsibility directive should also include reporting back about how they protect the information ecosystem against climate disinformation. As from our perspective, their first mandate is to provide right to access information for public in the EU. Let's go to the platform responses. What we did, a little bit more detailed information about what the Climate Action Against Disinformation researchers did. The coalition has been set up 2 years ago among more than 50 anti-disinformation and climate organizations, and it has been mandated to organize the community to curb climate disinformation together. That's why we developed a social card to analyze how well major platforms currently meet new EU regulations. We went through the DSA. We also went through the policy asks of the Climate Action Against Disinformation regarding how to curb climate disinformation. And then we developed 18 key points, questions, critical questions covering the policies and practices to prevent climate disinformation. After developing those points, I will show them in a moment. What we did is to analyze the last 3 code of practice reports submitted by platforms, and then also analyze their first round of DSA transparency reports submitted in October 2023. And by checking those reports, by checking what the platforms are saying in terms of how they combat climate disinformation, we try to see how much they cover climate disinformation threat in their implementation for protecting right to access information and protecting the information integrity in their platforms. I'm not going to read all these questions, but as you can see, these questions include questions related moderation, questions related the advertising industry and advertising work. For instance, whether they have a policy to prevent greenwashing, and also questions related to their community platforms and their daily regular practices, fact-checking systems, information ecosystem management standards, and so on, to understand better how they perform. You see the results here from the report. You will see the collated results in Thursday. Sorry, we were hoping to publish it a little bit earlier, but the last moment of the March reports changed the picture a little bit. And as you can see, almost all of them are getting 0 because unfortunately, almost all of them don't have any specific measurements to deal with the manipulation to hinder climate action. Yes, and the fundings are very basic. The worst was Facebook, but all the platforms are underperforming in their response to the DSA and in preventing climate disinformation. The reports are very superficial. They don't mention the details of how they take action. They don't mention any problems regarding their algorithmic amplification methodologies and their fact-checking methodologies or their community standards at all. What we see is that they don't specifically address climate disinformation at all in their advertising, and we know that one of the most common avenues of spreading disinformation is advertising. We know that climate disinformation is a political issue, but none of the platforms acknowledge the linkage between climate mis and disinformation and in policymaking processes. They don't have any tracking or reporting mechanisms about the users' activities who spread climate disinformation, although most of analysis done by different members of Climate Action Against Disinformation shows that we have handful amount of people who continuously violate and who continuously disseminate climate disinformation. We haven't seen any measures taken by the platforms against the frequent users who spread climate disinformation and have a lucrative business by spreading it. The third thing is fossil fuel sector is the main cause of climate disinformation in many revenues, in many different angles, and none of those companies have any restricting policy for restricting the advertisements coming from fossil fuel sector. Even the election times, fossil fuel sector have been publishing a lot of advertising and wrong claims using trying to protect their vested interests. We have seen many different cases. For instance, recently in the US, we have found out a couple of key actors of fossil fuel advertising. Fossil fuel companies were spreading LGBTI disinformation in a local town because there was a critical debate about gas infrastructure, and they tried to curb the overall size of the debate by introducing new, maybe more popular discussion about LGBT rights in the region, for instance. And none of those platforms have any particular mention of greenwashing in any of their community standards, any policies at all. They don't have any policies to prevent greenwashing, although greenwashing is getting intensified every day. And we see a lot of fossil fuel sector engagement in those advertising too. So what we do? What do we recommend to the EU policies? One is, although DSA beating directly covers climate disinformation activities in many angles, And although EU has been mentioning climate disinformation as a systemic risk in many different documentation in the essay, climate change and climate change disinformation hasn't been mentioned as a systemic risk. This gives a kind of a free rider ticket for platforms to not to talk about what they do on climate disinformation. Secondly, EU has a really good monitoring systems and infrastructure. However, most of monitoring is going through looking the content and checking the content and the actual piece of disinformation. But we suggest that it is much more efficient to target the networks and actors behind organized climate disinformation campaigns, because, as I said at the beginning, like we don't address, we try to deal with fossil fuel sector to curb CO2 emissions. Similarly, in disinformation, in climate disinformation, you need to deal with vested interests, the networks and actors behind the organized climate disinformation campaigns to prevent climate disinformation. From the reports, we see that although DSA Code of Practice on Disinformation, Green Claims, these are really good legislations, there is a gap between implementation and the legislation in most of the cases we have seen in the EU. That's why this gap also needs to be addressed by enforcing stronger transparency and accountability measures for platforms. For instance, it is still not clear what happens if Facebook doesn't fully implement what is written in the essay. These kind of gaps gives additional free rider ticket to the platforms to continue their business as usual. Also in the EU, we have been doing a lot of surveys to measure how much climate disinformation penetrated into the public discourse and how many people believe climate disinformation and decide accordingly in policy moments. But making surveys will not give you a whole picture. That's why we have been suggesting EU to focus and measure more about impacts of climate disinformation on public perception. For instance, we know that net zero is a huge debate, and there were a lot of political moments and policy moments to drive the net zero agenda. But in many geographies, net zero, either public don't understand what it is, or they think that it is a element to increase the government control over how they live. That kind of public perception will result in backfire and slow down the process. And the last thing, the climate disinformation is not a EU-specific threat, it's a global threat. We see more and more increasing climate disinformation attacks in both global north and global south. And EU has some mechanisms in a liberal democratic environment how to manage disinformation. And EU is also suffering a lot from climate disinformation. So we suggest that EU to take more leadership roles, to work with agencies like United Nations to deal with climate disinformation collectively, because internet doesn't have borders. So what is written in the US, we see in 2 days in the UK landed with the same narrative. In general, what we suggested recently to you is to increase the public diplomacy around curbing climate disinformation, improve the regulatory efforts and make connections. For instance, we need to make connection between green claims, between CSDR report, between DSA, to make sure that as a web of legislation, it provides enough protection for public to access right to information, access to information, and protect information integrity. And secondly, we recently suggested EU to conduct a broad polling and analysis in all European countries to see the level of threat and the harm done by climate disinformation. There are a couple of annexes here. You can see a little bit more about CAAD here. You can see the definition written by the coalition about climate disinformation. And you can see the detailed granular level of policy asks in this document. I will share the slides later with you. I hope I didn't talk too much so that we can have time to talk about, to answer your questions and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks to you, Devin, for sharing with us the results of the scorecard and all the set of recommendations to policymakers. Let's hope this turns into concrete actions. We cannot wait for the publication to be released. And also thanks to you and the Climate Action Against Disinformation, because as a result to your continued efforts, the European Commission will enhance the use of relevant policy tools, digital solutions, and communication approaches to fight climate disinformation. So Devin, now let's keep sharing your knowledge with the community. We are 46 people in the room, and I'm happy to open the Q&A session. Before that, let's share again the QR code of Slido. Yeah, there you have it on the screen. It's the tool we are using to raise questions. You can either scan it or join at slido.com #disinfo. We have around 25 minutes for questions, and yeah, I'm happy to see that we already have a few. All right, so Devin, let's go to the question on top. In an election year, we hear a lot about the impact of AI on elections. What impact does it have on climate disinformation?
Yeah, actually, AI has not only impact on climate disinformation, it has also an impact on ridiculous amount of usage of data, means ridiculous amount of usage of energy. It means it is very energy intensive, and it has also a lot of environment and sustainable impacts. Recently, Climate Action Against Disinformation published a report about AI and climate, which mainly outlines all these angles: environmental impact, CO2 impact. But specifically of climate disinformation, I will try to answer it simply. I mean, from our perspective, AI is a great tool for automation of the information distribute, and it amplifies the climate disinformation a lot in many angles. For instance, last year, before COP, Climate Action Against Disinformation detected more than 200 AI-generated bots publishing continuously stories, posts about how UAE and gas sector in the UAE is sustainable, how UAE is climate-friendly country before COP. We have seen that last year also during a discussion around new gas infrastructure in Texas. More than 200 AI bots were posting about how that infrastructure would bring welfare to the neighborhood it is installed, and so on. So AI has been frequently used in spreading disinformation, and it makes the disinformers or culprits work much more easier. And the last one thing about AI. So basically, AI scans every information in online platforms, in online ecosystem. As information ecosystem is polluted, what you ask to AI, sometimes the reply is totally wrong and misinformed replies, because it pulls the information from the polluted ecosystem. And we have seen a lot of cases where people were using AI responses as if it is true to spread information about climate, and basically they were wrong. So AI also has that kind of usage in terms of, and it has been informing people wrongly about climate-related issues.
Thank you, Devin. Now let's move to the second most voted question. It's about how climate-related topics are used by extremist groups to polarize European societies. You already mentioned it briefly during your presentation. Could you go a little bit further?
Many different ways we can see. One of them is during elections. We have seen a lot of cases where climate has been framed as a new conspiracy narrative to increase government control. and many people who are against government control, who wants to defend their freedom, and who wants to keep the society liberal, has been targeted by the climate disinformation, stating that if they would vote for Greens or they would vote for climate action, parties who are supporting climate action, they would lose their freedom. That is one of the angles. For instance, in the UK recently, we have seen 15-minute cities, as if climate action or as if net zero plans wants to keep people only in a very small areas and try to ban their travels. We see a lot of right-wing groups especially using it. Or another thing, for instance, Greta Thunberg has been getting a lot of hate messages, and climate disinformation has been used a lot by far right to attack, to derail the trust against climate scientists or climate actors like Greta and so on. And we can diversify these kind of attacks more and more. You can see every time from AfD, for instance, in German party, attacking climate policy, saying that climate policy means there will be no Germany in the future, for instance.
Yeah, it's been clear that the climate change has been politically weaponized. So next question, concerning the EU elections, how much disinformation and influence do you expect comes from third countries versus from inside EU?
Well, I mean, first, it's a language-wise question in a way. If it's an English conversation, you can see that like 70% or more than 55% of narratives you will see in English in the EU are already were either starting in the UK or in the US. Similarly, Spanish also. I mean, there is always synergies. You cannot put like, a percentage here, but we know that in the past, for instance, oil-rich countries promoted gas infrastructure in the EU. Recently, for instance, EU is very dependent on gas, and we know that Gazprom advertisements worked very well. I mean, Gazprom until the last year was the biggest sponsor of Champions League. I mean, and the gas and fossil fuels are not produced in the EU. So almost every fossil fuel related greenwashing or workwashing is coming from outside of EU.
Okay. I'm missing one question about narratives. Well, let's go to this one. Ed Cooper, disinfo researcher, talks about strategies like debunking and fact checkers not working. What do you think can overcome disinformation?
I totally agree. I totally agree that pre-banking and fact-checking are not working because of two dimensions. First, when you write the fact check, you try to address the factual information and factual truth, but information doesn't consist of only facts. It has also emotions in it. It has also emotional connections in it. And most of the cases, we believe people rather than we believe the information first. And in climate disinformation case or in disinformation case, the problem is the activities of the actors who have vested interest in spreading disinformation. That's why you need to target the actors. You need to target how they effectively and freely, like Wild West, spreading information. For us to overcome climate disinformation means overcoming the influence of fossil fuel industry in media ecosystem and information ecosystem. For us, we need to ban fossil fuel advertisements. We need to make sure that certain vested interests shouldn't be able to amplify whatever they are saying and use algorithmic tools to target different audiences. Because once disinformation is like an harper. When it hits somebody, it's very hard to pull it out. You cannot take it out because it becomes a belief. It's not just about fact itself, it's about the audience's perspective, the audience's understanding and everything. That's why when it's out, curbing it it's very hard. And fact checking is only read by people who believe that the initial information was wrong. So we focus on actors. I have been using this analogy a lot. In climate work, most of climate organizations, when you talk, you will see that they are not in favor of carbon capture. Same. We need to stop production of disinformation. instead of addressing or canceling it afterwards. Because it's not just 1 + 1 equals to 0. It's not just one negative. The disinformation can be canceled by positive disinformation and so on. Beyond that, there are also many different new research around the inoculation, which means that you first measure how disinformation is penetrated to public perception, and you organize a year-long campaign in that geography to make sure that public access the right information and so on, so that you can eliminate the impact of disinformation. But it is very expensive and long-term option.
Okay, Devin, so you're talking about actors. So what we've heard lately is that fossil fuel industry talks about the importance of safeguarding corporate free speech in the same way that, for example, politicians do. What would you say to these big companies?
Yeah, we need to protect freedom of speech. The problem is not about the freedom of speech, but disinformation, and nobody covers this. Disinformation violates one of the basic rights defined in the Universal Human Rights Declaration, which is right to access information. You cannot breathe when the room is full of CO2, right? So you cannot access information when almost all the corners of internet is like a sewer of disinformation. So dealing with disinformation is also an action to protect freedom of speech, because you cannot speak about something if you don't know, if you don't have the right information about the topic.
Yeah. Let's move on to same but different question. You are talking about topics like questions about the LGBTIQ community in this context. Could you go into that and tell us how this influences climate disinformation?
Yeah, as I was trying to say, for the vested interest we are talking about, the major carbon polluters, they want status quo to go on. So for that, they do use whatever tools they have to distract people or to disinform people. For instance, we have seen many times different pillars of disinformation, non-climate disinformation, has been used by vested interests to attack a climate-related policy movement. For instance, in the UAE, we have seen a lot of agitations due to the Israel and Palestine conflict, trying to divide the climate movement into two groups. Because when you divide the climate movement will not cooperate and target the real causes of the problem. So for vested interests, they try to find the easiest and most robust way to distract or disinform people, and many times, unfortunately, gender-related disinformation or LGBTIQ-related disinformation is one of the avenues they continuously use, because they know that there will be always an audience who would immediately buy it.
Definitely. Thank you, Devin. Another question. Yeah, at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned foreign interference as related to climate disinformation. Could you elaborate a bit on this?
Yes, definitely. For instance, whenever there is a moment in Europe about discussing whether they will extend the pipeline or whether they will invest. Let me give you actually a little bit more better example. It's from not EU, but it's from Europe. It's from UK, the ex-EU. The GB News, one of the new emerged websites and news outlets in the UK called Great Britain News, which is a very far-right niche audience. Recently, an American partner published a report comparing about the narratives used by GB News and with the narratives emerged in the USA. 95% of the stories in the GB News first created in the USA, for instance, and we see big carbon bubbles, carbon investors have been supporting GB News to stay, to function and spreading the news. Or in Europe case, Russian disinformation. Until the Ukraine war, Gazprom was one of the most trusted companies in the Europe because of all the advertisements they have been doing. or their sport washing in the UK, and so on. So there are many foreign actors who have been trying to, because they have an interest in keeping Europe in track of fossil fuel economy. So they have been pushing narratives to protect their interest. We have seen a lot of narratives coming from Middle East, saying that gas is a solution for climate, not a problem. We have seen a lot of narratives coming from other countries saying that we shouldn't ditch out diesel cars because EVs are much more harmful, and so on. And most of the cases we see either these narratives are generated in the outside of Europe first time and organically, or like, connections in the online media coming, or sometimes they were introduced directly by these foreign actors, media, state-owned outlets in Europe first.
Okay, thank you. So following with the narratives, we have this question. He's asking if you could elaborate on climate change conspiracy narratives and what, if any, overlap you may have observed with other conspiracy theory discourse.
Well, I mean, I am not 100% right person to answer, to elaborate this in the details, but we see that increasing distrust in democratic organizations and increasing inequalities in the society has empowered the image of elites are managing us. And in most of cases, we see climate change has been used as if it is an argument pushed by top rich 1% of the world to control, to further control the societies and so on. And they have been creating different versions of that kind of narrative. For instance, 15 minute cities is one of them. Saying many discussions in the UK, you can see that they claim that all the net zero policies, if they will be implemented, people will not be will not be able to freely travel to their hometowns, to outside foreign countries, and so on. They have to live in a small city where they can access everything in 15 minutes, and that will be the bubble of their life kind of discourses. Or in Europe, many times we have seen Greta was attacked as a foreign agent, saying that she tries to she tries to, I don't know, she hates from Germany, for instance, so she tries to further create social division in society by climate march. Or in many cases in Spain, for instance, she has been claimed that she has been organizing young people so that they will distrust their governments and they will uprise and so on. There are many different versions, but basically always it's about a group of people who tries to cheat all society to set up a dystopic world of totalitarian regimes and so on.
Yeah, so we see that these information narratives are diversifying. Would you say this is to reach more of an audience in the middle?
Time to time, yes. Time to time, also, climate disinformation has been used to strengthen their blogs and prevent the penetration of penetration. I mean, audiences are not different audience groups don't have strict borders, right? There are always transfers of information of people between us, and sometimes we have seen that climate disinformation has been used to block any narrative coming from climate groups to access far-right people, for instance. Because in the end, whatever climate action states is also for welfare of far-right people too. I mean, we don't differentiate people, we don't differentiate climate action according to people's political views. But sometimes we see far-right groups are trying to use a cocktail of gender, climate, trans, I don't know, anti-government disinformation or vaccine disinformation to keep their people behind themselves and to keep their people just to continue to engage with the information outlets or engage with the outlets that are from far right. one of the things we see a lot about climate disinformation is it has been used to attack New York Times, for instance, many times, or Politico, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Devin. And now we have a more technological question. The question is, have you worked with botometer and programs that map bots online? And if so, what has it revealed?
I don't know botometer, but there are some tools we use for mapping more bots. We have used one of them prior to the COP28 in Dubai to expose how UAE was greenwashed. UAE is greenwashing through influencers, but unfortunately, in last 2 years, the data access has become much more difficult since Elon Musk purchased Twitter. So as far as I know, many tools like botometers cannot work efficiently right now due to the increasing restrictions coming from platforms to access data, and that's why actually we think DSA is quite important because DSA explicitly states platforms need to share all the relevant data with researchers, not academics, with researchers. That includes non-profit organizations. Until now, none of them shared anything yet. Facebook decided to close Crowdtangle, saying that they will bring something better. Who knows? So I think one of the avenues in the EU and one of the opportunities that the DSA gives us, the researchers, the people fighting against disinformation, is to further push platforms to provide data access as the law asks them to do. And without that kind of detailed surgical level access to the data in platforms, it is very hard to identify bots, especially after AI, because like the bots we identified, only 20 of them were identified by tools, but then we had 5 researchers digging the followers, retweeters of those actors, and we identified 180 AI bots next to it, because AI makes detecting bots very, very difficult.
Thank you, Devin. You already gave us your point of view on debunking and fact-checking, but we have this new question. Maybe you can add something else. So it says, when you see lie, it's quickly made and easily repeated. A critical reply requires data, reasoning, and multiple pages, and it is difficult to spread. How to solve this?
Well, actually, sometimes even it doesn't matter whether you have data, reasoning, or multiple pages. If a viewer doesn't go to web page regularly that you publish the stories or you publish these multiple pages stuff, you can solve it. Again, I will probably repeat myself. Disinformation is a sophisticated lie. You need to shut up the liar. You need to I'm not talking about banning, I'm not talking about censoring, but you need to make sure that if somebody lies, they don't get artificial algorithmic amplification. We cannot allow offenders of information ecosystems, people who are frequently distributing disinformation, to advertise those disinformation pieces, or to get advertising money because of the fact that their content is getting a lot of clicks and so on. So the problem is the current business model is the problem of disinformation. The current business model of platforms or search engines is only promoting the engagement, more and more engagement, and that is the problem. We need to solve the algorithmic business model of the current online platforms or news outlets and so on, because currently they don't. In the past, newspapers, when I was growing up, when I was 10, I'm 40 years old, we didn't have internet during that time. There was a value for a journalist, and there is even an economic value for a journalist to bring right information, robust news, and publish them. Now, with these technologies, there is no value of truth at all. Only value is how many people liked it, how many people retweeted. I mean, we have seen Benetton's, like, Benetton has been using diversity as a advertising element for a long time. But we have seen Benetton's ads next to AFD's major outlet in Germany because those outlets posts were getting huge engagements and so on. The problem is we value right now in the ecosystem, disinformation is a lucrative value right now in the ecosystem, and producing disinformation is very, very profitable. To solve this information problem, we need to make sure that it becomes a material risk for institutions who are engaging with disinformation. We need to make sure that people who are spreading disinformation are being responsible and paying their they need to pay what they do. Currently, nobody pays it. This is the problem.
Thank you, Devin. I would love to keep going with this conversation, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. Thank you, Devin, again for the presentation and this fruitful contribution during the Q&A. We can only hope that this will represent significant progress in harmonizing EU environmental and climate policies with broader regulatory initiatives. Thanks to the audience for your interest. And before closing this webinar, I just wish to announce that we have a few more coming in, featuring top experts. Next week, on the 25th of April, Craig Silverman from ProPublica will show us the tools and techniques for using AI in digital investigations. The agenda is already packed in May. On the 7th, we will host a webinar on FIMI in elections. Can the past predict the future? With Margot Fuldt-Hardy from Red and Blue Consulting. Markus Bosch from the Hamburg University will dig on how propaganda and disinformation is spread on TikTok. This will happen on the 23rd of May. And on the 30th of May, Sophie Murphy-Byrne from Logically will explain the impact of AI during elections. And before leaving, please give us an extra minute. You will have access to a rating survey at the end of the webinar. Also, in that survey, you can suggest future topics to be covered in our EU DisinfoLab series of webinars. So we hope to keep seeing you around. Don't forget that the registration to EU DisinfoLab annual conference to be held in Riga next month of October, it's already open. Thanks again, Devin. Thanks to the Heinrich Böll Foundation for helping us organize today's webinar. And thank you everyone who attended. Have a wonderful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye.